The glass struck the marble fireplace surround and shattered. Rosalind did not flinch. She stood in the center of the study at Ashmore Park, her hands clasped at her waist, and watched Edmund's face go white, then rigid, the way stone goes rigid when the sculptor finally stops working it and leaves it to the cold air. The fire behind him was low. One candle on the desk had guttered out. In the long silence that followed the breaking of the glass, she heard the house breathe around them, the creak of old timber, the distant sound of a footman's tread in the passage below. And she understood, with the particular clarity that grief sometimes produces, that the man she had married 3 months ago did not believe her. "I cannot have children," he said. His voice was level, quieter than she expected after the glass. "The surgeon's letter is in my coat pocket. It has been in my coat pocket for 3 years. Whatever you are telling me, Rosalind, it is not that." She said nothing. She had been 22 years old for exactly 6 weeks. She did not look away from his face. He turned toward the window, and she could see the line of his jaw in the pale June light. And she thought of the folded letter she had read once, with his permission 2 months earlier, on the evening he had first chosen to show her who he was, beneath the discipline. She thought of how carefully he had unfolded it, how the paper had been soft with handling, how she had not said a single word to make him feel small for carrying it. She had not earned a single moment of warmth in this house by being anything other than entirely herself, and she was not going to begin now by defending herself against something he could not yet see clearly. She left the study. She walked to the room she had occupied as his wife, gathered the one trunk that held her own possessions, and by morning, she was gone. It had all begun in London, in the 3rd week of March, at the very start of the season. Rosalind had come to Lady Dorothea Vane as a replacement for a young woman named Miss Preston, who had held the position of companion for 11 months before being dismissed without a character reference over a matter that Lady Dorothea described only as a want of discretion. The want of discretion, as best Rosalind could determine in her first week, had consisted of Miss Preston laughing too readily at a remark that Lady Dorothea had not intended to be amusing. This told Rosalind a great deal about the household she had entered, and she filed the information away with the same quiet precision with which she filed most things, and said nothing about it to anyone. She had been 21 years old when she took the position. Her father had died the previous autumn, leaving 3 modest debts and no entail, only a rented house in Shropshire that must be vacated by December. She had one older brother in the Navy who sent money when he could, which was rarely. She had no other relations of any practical consequence. A companion's wages were £11 per annum, with room and board provided, which was not sufficient to maintain any kind of independence when the position ended, as all such positions eventually ended. She understood that she was employed to be useful without being visible, present without being noticed, agreeable without having opinions. She understood all of this and accepted it, because the alternative was a winter without a roof, and she had never been a woman who confused her feelings about a situation with the situation itself. Lady Dorothea's London house stood near Grosvenor Square, narrow-fronted and impeccably maintained. Lady Dorothea herself was 61 years old, lean and upright as a court candle, with gray eyes that moved across a room in a single pass and missed very little. She was not, Rosalind thought, a woman of deliberate cruelty. She was a woman whose world had a correct shape, and anyone who disturbed that shape was a problem to be solved, never a person to be understood. She introduced Rosalind to Miss Cecily Farrow on the 2nd day, in the drawing room after morning calls, and the introduction contained its own verdict. Cecily was 20 years old, fair-haired, and wore a gown of pale yellow silk that had clearly been cut by a French modiste. Lady Dorothea presented her with a particular warmth that she never directed at Rosalind. "Miss Hartley is our companion this season," Lady Dorothea said to Cecily, as if Rosalind were a piece of furniture that had recently been moved into a more convenient position. "She has very steady nerves. One needs steady nerves in a companion." A pause, measured and precise. "Merely a companion, of course, but a useful sort." Cecily smiled. The smile was pleasant and entirely without awareness that any injury had been done. That was, Rosalind recognized, the most effective kind of dismissal. Edmund Vane, Duke of Ashmore, arrived in London 2 weeks into the season, later than expected, and with no advance notice given to his mother's household. Rosalind was in the second-floor sitting room when she heard his voice in the entrance hall below, clipped and carrying, the voice of a man accustomed to rooms falling quiet when he entered them. She did not go to the landing to look. She continued reading the passage from the botanical treatise that Lady Dorothea had asked her to locate, found the relevant page, and marked it with a strip of paper. She met him that evening at dinner. He was 34 years old, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and the particular stillness of a man who had learned to treat every social occasion as a terrain to be assessed before it was entered. He was not, she thought, a cold man in the way that men who have never felt warmth are cold. He was cold in the way that a room is cold when something has been removed from it and nothing has been put in its place. He looked at her once across the dinner table when Lady Dorothea mentioned in passing that the companion had been kind enough to locate the withering reference, and his gaze was brief and direct, and told her nothing. She looked back with the same quality of attention, which seemed to briefly surprise him, though his face did not change. The dismissive label settled into place in the second week. Lady Dorothea used it first within Rosalind's hearing at a morning call attended by 3 other women of similar rank, 2 of whom went on to repeat it freely across the subsequent days. Merely the companion became the shorthand by which Rosalind was identified in any room that contained both her and people of consequence, a phrase so smoothly deployed that it carried the weight of a formal verdict without the discomfort of being issued as one. Rosalind heard it 6 times in 4 days. By the 6th time, it had ceased to register as an injury and had become instead a kind of information. This household required a certain type of woman, and she was not it. And everyone in the relevant circles had been notified. She did not know, in those early London days, that Edmund heard it too. At the end of March, the household moved to Ashmore Park in Kent, 80 miles from London, for what Lady Dorothea called the country fortnight, and which in practice meant the 6 weeks before the season's first great balls demanded everyone's return to town. The park itself was older than anything Rosalind had lived inside before, stone-fronted and ivy-covered, with a kitchen garden that ran the full length of the east wing, and a library on the ground floor whose shelves held books that had never been catalogued and which she would have given a great deal to spend an afternoon alone among. It was on the 3rd morning at Ashmore that she discovered Thomas. No one had prepared her for Thomas. Lady Dorothea had not mentioned him. She had come across him in the long gallery on the 1st floor while she was carrying a letter to the post table. A small boy of 7 years sitting cross-legged on the floor with a book open in his lap. And when she said good morning, he had not replied. She had assumed briefly that he was absorbed. And then she had crouched down, gently, and caught his eye. And he had looked at her with the patient alertness of a child who has learned to read the world through means other than sound. She stayed for an hour. She found a pencil in her pocket and a spare leaf of paper, and they had a conversation in written fragments and gestures, the boy grave and precise in his responses, Rosalind attentive and unhurried. She returned the following morning with a book of engravings she had found on the lower library shelves, images of birds and landscapes, and she began pointing and writing the names, and he began writing them back, and then she discovered, by accident, that he could hear low sound if it was close and sufficiently resonant. She began reading aloud in a slow, deliberate register, very near, her hand resting near his so he could feel the vibration through the floorboards, and the boy listened with his entire body. Edmund came into the gallery on the second morning without announcement. Rosalind did not hear him enter. She was reading from a natural history she had taken from the library shelf, describing the migration of swallows, and she became aware of him only when Thomas looked up and passed her shoulder with an expression that was not alarm, but its opposite, the specific settling a child does when someone familiar has entered the room. She turned and found Edmund standing near the door, coat dusty from the road, hat still in his hand, watching them both with an expression that was entirely unguarded for the 3 seconds before his face reassembled itself into its customary order. "Your Grace," she said, and rose, and stood with her hands at her sides. He looked at Thomas, who was already watching him with the same patient alertness. He looked at the book in Rosalind's hand. He said in a tone that she could not quite read, "He does not often sit quietly for long." "He sat for the full hour yesterday," she said. "He attends very well when the text has clear images to accompany it." Edmund looked at her for a moment, a look that was not the dinner-table glance she had catalogued, but something slower and more considered. Then he said, "See that you have enough candles in here. The morning light on this end of the gallery is insufficient." And he left. Rosalind looked at Thomas, who was already looking back at her with an expression that might, in another child, have been amusement. The incident she later understood as the witnessing scene occurred 2 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning, in the housekeeper's parlor adjacent to the service stairs. Lady Dorothea had summoned Rosalind on a pretext she did not bother to make convincing, and once the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable, had been sent out of the room, she placed on the table between them a small envelope whose weight Rosalind could assess at a glance. "There has been some difficulty," Lady Dorothea said, "regarding a particular housemaid, a young woman named Agnes. She has been spreading reports about a visitor to the house, reports that are without foundation, and I require someone to speak to the matter in confidence, to confirm that the reports are without foundation, so the girl can be quietly removed without any unpleasantness attaching to the house." Rosalind looked at the envelope. She looked at Lady Dorothea. "I have no knowledge of any such reports," she said, "and I have had no occasion to observe anything that would confirm or deny them." "The envelope," Lady Dorothea said, "would assist in your recollection." "It would not," Rosalind said. "I am not able to confirm something I did not witness, Your Grace. I am sorry to be of no use to you in this particular matter." Lady Dorothea looked at her for a long moment, the gray eyes assessing and cold. "You are remarkably unhelpful for a companion with no character reference to fall back on," she said. "Yes," Rosalind said. "I expect I am." She left the envelope on the table. She did not know, until several days later, that Edmund had been in the passage outside the parlor door. She did not know he had heard the exchange from beginning to end. The candles in the gallery were replaced before afternoon, and a new shelf of natural history texts appeared near the window where Thomas liked to sit, and she might have attributed this to coincidence had she not, by then, begun to understand the particular quality of Edmund's attention. If Rosalind had permitted herself to take stock of herself at that point in the story, she might have noted that she was already in considerable difficulty. Edmund Vane was cold and formal, and given to short declarative instructions that she had learned to interpret correctly, despite their surface. "The afternoon is mild," meant she should take Thomas outside. "The library is not in use this morning, meant she was welcome in it. "You will want a shawl if you walk in the East Garden," was apparently his version of extended conversation. She had begun to wait for these small, directed observations with more attention than was wise for a woman in her position, and she had noticed that he issued them only when no one else was immediately present to hear them. She had been very careful not to think too precisely about what this meant. The proposal arrived on a Wednesday in the library, where they had twice before found themselves occupying the same space in a way that was technically accidental, and practically not. Edmund came in while she was cataloging the upper shelf, and he closed the door behind him, which he had not done before, and she understood before he spoke that the conversation that followed was going to require the door to be closed. He stood near the writing table. He did not perform uncertainty. "There is a creditor's trust clause that requires satisfaction by midsummer," he said. "The terms require a wife of respectable character. My mother has proposed Miss Farrow, and the Farrow family is agreeable. I have declined on 2 separate occasions and expect to decline again." He paused. "I am explaining this because I want you to understand that the proposal I am about to make is not derived from convention or from any pressure my mother is capable of exerting." Rosalind set down the book she was holding. "Your position in this household is not secure," he continued, and his voice had the directness of a man who considers it a greater kindness to say a difficult thing plainly than to dress it in propriety. "My mother will dismiss you at the end of the season. She will not provide a character reference. You will have nowhere to go." He paused again. "I would like to prevent that from occurring. I require a wife. The terms would be practical, and the arrangement entered freely. I would not ask of you what you were not prepared to give." Rosalind considered him for a moment. She thought of the £11 per annum. She thought of the December lease, and the Shropshire house already vacated. She thought of Miss Preston, dismissed for laughing in the wrong moment. Somewhere in England with no character reference and no prospects. She thought of Thomas in the gallery with his book of engravings, and she thought of the tone in which Edmund had said, "He does not often sit quietly for long," which she understood now was the tone of a man who had been grieving a silence he did not know how to reach across. "There is something you have not told me," she said quietly. "That bears on the terms." His jaw tightened. Then slowly, he reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded letter. The paper was soft with handling, the fold lines deep and worn. He held it out to her, and she read it. A surgeon named Mr. Cavendish, dated 3 years prior, precise in its clinical vocabulary and entirely clear in its conclusion. A fever the previous winter had left consequences that made fatherhood, in Mr. Cavendish's considered opinion, an impossibility. The language was careful and not unkind, but it carried all the weight of a closing door. She handed it back to him. She said, "I am very sorry." And she meant it with the full measure of what she was, which was a woman who said things she meant, and nothing she did not. He refolded the letter. He put it back in his pocket. He said, "The practical terms of the arrangement are unaffected by it." "I understand," she said. "Do you accept?" She looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. "I do." The banns were called at the parish church at Ashmore Village over 3 successive Sundays in April and May, the vicar reading her name alongside his in a voice that carried over the scrubbed stone of the church floor. And she sat in the front pew and was aware of Cecily Farrow 2 pews back with a stillness that was its own kind of protest. Lady Dorothea sat beside Rosalind on the 2nd Sunday and did not speak to her before or after the service, and when she encountered Cecily in the entrance hall that afternoon, she said, within Rosalind's clear hearing, that the arrangement was practical in the short term and unlikely to produce anything permanent, as practical arrangements so rarely did. The third voicing of the label came from a visiting cousin of the Pharaoh family, who appeared at a dinner in the third week of May. A stout woman named Mrs. Hartington, who surveyed Rosalind across the length of the dining table, and said to the woman beside her, loudly enough to be heard above the candle-lit conversation, "She was the companion, was she?" I had not understood that he meant to marry merely the companion. The word merely fell on the table like a knife. Mrs. Hartington appeared to find nothing remarkable in having said it. Edmund, at the head of the table, set down his wine-glass with the particular deliberation of a man preventing himself from doing something that would require explanation, and said, in a voice that carried the full length of the room, "Mrs. Hartington, you were asking about the new plantings in the east kitchen garden. My steward is particularly pleased with the asparagus beds." Mrs. Hartington turned to the steward, and the moment closed. Rosalind looked at her own plate. She felt the heat rise briefly at the back of her neck. She did not let it show. They were married on the 23rd of May in the same parish church, with Mrs. Gable and the head groom as witnesses, and Thomas in his best coat sitting in the front pew with a posture so careful and correct that it made Rosalind's chest feel tight in a way she had not anticipated. She wore her best afternoon gown, a pale gray silk that was not a wedding gown by any conventional measure, and Edmund placed the ring on her hand with the same precise attentiveness he directed at everything he did. And when the vicar said the words that made her, Rosalind Vane, Duchess of Ashmore, she felt the shift in the air around her, as if the room had been rearranged in her absence. If you have been watching Rosalind's story unfold and finding something of yourself in it, this might be the moment to press the like and leave a thought in the comments. She has not yet arrived at the place this story is carrying her toward, and neither have we. The 5 weeks between the ceremony and the dark moment were the most specifically complicated of Rosalind's life. She had married a man she respected deeply and had come to feel things for that went considerably past respect, and she was tolerably certain that he had come to feel things for her that went past the practical terms they had both agreed to. He came to the gallery more often now. He sat with Thomas and watched her work with the boy, and occasionally he would add something to the conversation she and Thomas were having in their accumulated language of writing and gesture and slow, careful speech. And she could see, without any effort, how much he loved the child and how helpless that love made him feel. Because Thomas had come to Ashmore Park as a ward after the death of a young cousin, a child who had needed someone to reach him, and Edmund had not known how to do it. Rosalind did. She knew he watched her in the evenings when they sat together in the library after dinner. And she knew, without vanity, what the watching meant. She knew the precise morning in early June when the distance between them became an agreement rather than a gap. And she knew the particular quality of quiet that settled between them afterward, warm and slightly unsteady, like a candle burning in a draught. She did not tell him about the pregnancy for 3 weeks. She was not entirely certain herself for the first of those weeks. She was entirely certain for the remaining 2, and she spent those 2 weeks turning over in her mind the folded letter in his coat pocket, the precise language of Mr. Cavendish's verdict, and the extraordinary quietness of what she was carrying. She did not speak to anyone about it. There was no one to speak to. She was the Duchess and the former companion, and there was not a woman in the household whose position made such a confidence possible. She chose to tell him on a Tuesday evening, in the study where he had been working on the estate accounts. The room was warm. The fire was burning low. She stood across the writing table from him, and she said, in a voice that was steady because she had made it so, "Edmund, I am pregnant." The glass was in his hand. She watched it leave his hand. She heard it shatter against the marble surround of the fireplace, and she watched his face go through the sequence she had not expected. Not anger, exactly, but something beneath anger. Something that lived in the same place as the folded letter. The place where he had stored the surgeon's verdict and built his entire understanding of his future around it. "I cannot have children," he said. "You have read the letter. You know what it says." "I know what it says," she agreed. "Then what you are telling me is impossible." She looked at him. She had prepared for his disbelief. She had not entirely prepared for how it would feel to be the truth in the room, while someone she loved decided that the truth was a lie. "It is evidently not impossible," she said quietly. "I can only tell you what is." He said something she had not anticipated. He said, "My mother told me last week that you were unhappy with the terms of the arrangement. She said you had confided in her that you had hoped for a more permanent resolution." Rosalind felt the cold move through her then, the specific cold of understanding how precisely an enemy has planned her ground. Lady Dorothea had said no such thing to her. Lady Dorothea had said it to Edmund. She looked at him, and she understood in the same moment that she was not going to contest it. Not because it was unanswerable, but because the man across the table from her had a surgeon's letter and a dead certainty, and a mother who had spent 3 months laying the groundwork for this exact moment. And no amount of her saying it was untrue was going to move him tonight. He needed to arrive at the truth himself, by whatever path it took him. She left the study. She packed her trunk and she departed before dawn, taking the hired carriage to the coaching inn at Ashmore Village, carrying nothing that belonged to the house, nothing of his, only the plain gray silk and the ring, which she wore because she had been given it in a church, and removing it felt like a dishonesty she was not willing to perform. What she did not know, when the carriage wheels turned on the gravel of Ashmore Park's drive in the gray morning, was that Edmund had spent the remainder of that night not in sleep, but at his writing table with 2 letters before him. One was Mr. Cavendish's, soft with 3 years of folding. The other had arrived by post 4 days earlier, from a physician named Dr. Emmett in Harley Street, to whom Edmund had written in April, with the particular half-acknowledged hope of a man who is trying not to acknowledge that he has begun to hope again. Dr. Emmett's letter described 3 documented cases of recovery from post-fever azoospermia, partial and unpredictable, in men of Edmund's medical history and his age range. Dr. Emmett wished to examine him at his earliest convenience. Edmund had not yet opened the letter to its 2nd page, where the examination's finding was recorded. He had set it aside unfinished when the estate accounts had demanded attention. And then Rosalind had come into the study. And everything else had ceased to exist. He read the 2nd page at 3 in the morning. He sat with it for a considerable while. Then he put it in his coat pocket beside Mr. Cavendish's letter. And he went to the room that was Rosalind's room and found it empty. And the cold of the empty room was a different kind of cold from everything he had carried for 3 years. Lady Dorothea's confidence, in the 2 weeks that followed, inflated steadily. Cecily Farrow returned to Ashmore Park. There was talk of an annulment on grounds of incompatibility. Mr. Holt, the family solicitor, was summoned from London, a careful, sparse-spoken man of 53, with the bearing of someone who has delivered difficult news so many times that he has made a philosophy of precision. He arrived at Ashmore in the 2nd week of June, conferred with Edmund for 2 hours, and departed with the trust clause documents and a list of instructions that Lady Dorothea was not given access to. In the Ashmore Village Inn, where Rosalind had remained because she had nowhere else to go, and because she had decided quite clearly that she would not leave until she had found a situation that would allow her to manage what was coming, she continued her days with the same quiet method she had always used. She wrote to her brother. She wrote to 2 agencies. She sat in the parlor of the inn and read what books the house could furnish her. And she thought about Thomas in the long gallery with his birds and his engravings. And she thought about Edmund at the head of the dining table, redirecting Mrs. Hartington's cruelty with the precision of a man who had decided, in that moment, that he was not going to permit it. And she allowed herself to grieve what she did not yet know, whether she had lost. The Midsummer Ball at Ashmore Park was the first great ball of the season, the occasion that Lady Dorothea had organized each year for 11 years, and whose guest list ran to 140 persons drawn from the best houses in Kent and from London households who had made the journey south. The ballroom was on the east side of the great house, high-ceilinged and brilliantly lit, and on the evening of the 23rd of June it held all of those 140 persons in their summer silks and their best jewels, and the music had been playing for 40 minutes when Rosalind arrived. She had been delivered an invitation by hand that morning. Not a letter, not a card. A sealed note in Edmund's handwriting that said only, "Please come. You should be present. R.H.V." The last 3 letters were her initials as she was now designated, Rosalind Hartley Vane, and she held the note for a long time at the parlor table of the inn before she folded it into her pocket and asked the innkeeper's wife to press her gray silk. She entered the ballroom at 9:15. She wore the gray silk and the ring and no other ornament, and she stood at the door for a moment while the room adjusted to her presence, its small currents of attention shifting and resettling. Lady Dorothea was seated near the north wall with Cecily Farrow arranged at her right hand, and when her eyes found Rosalind there was a brief flash of something, calculation perhaps, recalibration, the look of a woman who has made a plan and now must decide how quickly it needs to change. Miss Farrow looked at her with polite surprise and a composure that was, Rosalind thought, a credit to her upbringing, if nothing else. The ballroom had been built for visibility. There was no position in it from which one could stand unobserved, and Rosalind was entirely aware of being observed, of the whisper moving along the near wall, of the phrase she had heard 6 times in 3 months, making its way between the candelabras and the champagne glasses. She stood still. She had been standing still in rooms that required her to be invisible for long enough that she had developed a particular quality of patience. Not passive, and not resigned, but the kind of stillness that comes from knowing one's own weight. She saw Edmund when he was already crossing the room toward her. He had covered perhaps 20 feet of the distance between them when Mr. Holt appeared at the edge of the crowd near the musicians' platform, and the solicitor's presence was noted by several people who understood its significance, including Lady Dorothea, whose fan paused in its movement for the first time that evening. Edmund did not stop. He crossed the ballroom floor in the manner of a man who had decided something irrevocably and was engaged in the business of acting on it. The crowd parted for him without being asked. That was what rank did. That was what the clarity of intention did when the two were combined. He stopped before her. He was close enough that she could see the particular line of tension at the corner of his jaw and the way he was looking at her, which was the opposite of the dinner-table glance with which she had catalogued him in London. This was the look from the gallery doorway, the unguarded 3 seconds, held now without recalling itself. "You stayed," he said. His voice was low. "I had nowhere better to be," she said, which was true, and also not the entire truth. And she thought he understood the remainder of it. He reached into his coat pocket. He drew out 2 folded letters and held them briefly where she could see them. "Mr. Cavendish is worn and soft. Dr. Emmett's, crisper and newer. He did not offer them to her. He held them for a moment in a way that named them, and then he put them back. And she understood that the gesture was not evidence, not argument, but acknowledgement. He was telling her he knew. He was telling her that he had known for 2 weeks. That he had spent those 2 weeks in the particular company of a man who has understood precisely what he broke and what he must now choose. "I owe you an accounting," he said, "that I am not equipped to give you in front of 140 people. I am aware of that," she said. "You are my wife," he said, and the room was quiet enough, in the specific radius that had opened around them, that the people standing nearest heard it clearly. Not a declaration exactly, not a speech, an identification, a naming. The word wife landing in the Ashmore ballroom with the weight of a man who was using it to tell the room, and the woman before him, and himself, what he had been too certain of his own wound to say before. Mr. Holt had moved to stand at Edmund's shoulder. He cleared his throat in the manner of a man who has been asked to perform a function and intends to perform it correctly. "My lord and lady," he said, addressing the general company with a brevity that was itself a statement. "The terms of the creditor's trust clause have been satisfied under the current arrangement. A second physician's examination has overturned the prior medical finding. All parties should consider the settlement final." He said nothing further. He did not need to. He nodded to Edmund, tucked his document case under his arm, and began making his way toward the door, with the steady purpose of a man who has done his work and wishes to catch the last post to London. Lady Dorothea's fan resumed its movement. It moved more slowly than before. Cecily looked at the fan, and then at Edmund, and then at Rosalind, and her expression contained the particular quality of a young woman who has just understood that the role she had been prepared for was never actually available to her, had never been the decision that was hers to make. It was not a cruel recognition. It was simply the truth landing. And to her credit, she absorbed it with a composure that asked for nothing from anyone in the room. The whisper that had been moving along the walls changed register. Rosalind felt it change. She had been in enough rooms to know when the room's verdict was revising itself, when the social machinery that had been running in one direction encountered something it could not process, and began, slowly and without announcement, to run in the other. Edmund offered her his arm. She placed her hand on it. The room, all 140 people of it, watched. She was aware of Mrs. Gable near the servants' corridor door, the housekeeper's face carrying an expression that was private and warm and entirely unsuitable for a housekeeper at a formal occasion, and she thought she had not been the only one in this house who had been waiting for this particular evening. She thought of Thomas, upstairs in his room with a candle and his latest book of engravings, being watched over by the young nursemaid who had been given very clear instructions about the hour at which he was to sleep. She thought of the folded letter in Edmund's pocket, worn soft along its creases, and what it would mean to no longer need to carry it. She did not look at Lady Dorothea. She did not need to. The dowager's verdict on this moment would be whatever it would be, and Rosalind had no quarrel with a woman who had organized her world around a certainty that turned out to be wrong. She had been wrong herself, about simpler things. What she hoped, with the particular precision of her feelings, was that Lady Dorothea would find a way to revise the certainty rather than defend it, because defending it would be a waste of a perfectly capable woman's remaining years, and she had enough experience of waste to find it grievous. The music began again. Edmund guided her onto the floor, and she felt the warmth of his hand through the gray silk, and the room resumed its motion around them. And she allowed herself, for the first time in 3 months, to settle fully into the fact that she was in the place she was. Ashmore Park in autumn was a different house from the one she had entered in March. The ivy on the east wall had gone dark red, and the kitchen garden had finished its asparagus and moved on to the last of the season's beans. And the long gallery had been refurnished with a second writing table and a proper lamp for the window end where Thomas preferred to work. The fire in the study was built up in the evenings now. The writing table held 2 pairs of candles instead of 1. Edmund had stopped carrying the coat he had used through the spring and summer, the one with the surgeon's letter in its pocket, and on an evening in October, with the rain quiet on the windows and Thomas asleep upstairs, and the house settled around them into its specific autumn quiet. He took the letter out for the last time. He set it on the hearthstone. He looked at it for a moment in the firelight. The soft, worn paper. The careful handwriting. The 3 years of folding. Then he looked at Rosalind, who was sitting with her feet tucked under her on the study's settee, in a manner that Lady Dorothea would have found entirely unsuitable for a duchess, and which Edmund had never once suggested she alter. She nodded, very slightly. He put the letter in the fire. They watched it catch and brighten and reduce to nothing in the time it took the coal beneath it to shift and settle. In the gallery the following morning, Thomas was sitting at his writing table with the lamp lit when Rosalind came in with the new volume of engravings she had ordered from London. Birds of the Southern Hemisphere. Plates so clear that she had pressed her nose to the glass of the bookseller's window before she ordered them. She set the book on the table, and he opened it, and she sat beside him and began to read aloud in the slow, careful register she had developed for him over months, her hand near his on the table where the vibration of her voice reached him through the wood. She was halfway through the description of a wandering albatross, its wingspan and its particular talent for covering great distances on almost no effort at all, when Thomas put his finger on the engraving and said, very quietly and with the careful deliberateness of a word that had been assembled from components and tried in private many times before being offered to an audience. Bird. The word was small and slightly imprecise and entirely clear. Rosalind did not make a sound. She set her hand over his very gently, and she looked at the engraving with him. And the morning light came through the gallery windows and lay across the table between them. And outside, the last of the autumn leaves were moving in the wind from the south. The house held that sound as if it had been waiting years to hold it. If Rosalind's story has moved you, leave your favorite moment in the comments below. This channel exists because of the people who watch until the last page, and we are glad you were here for this one.